Hey guys, welcome back to Pastoral Apologetics, and I want to start a series of videos that we're going to do called What's This Book of the Bible About? Because that's, I think, one of the challenges that people have as they start reading a book of the Bible. They don't really know what it's about, what's the goal, and what's happening. So if we're going to start somewhere, we start at the beginning, right? And we start at the book of Genesis. What is the book of Genesis about? So before we actually get into it, let's talk about a few introductory details. The goal of Genesis, and really the Bible in general, is not to give us a detailed genealogy of every person who's ever lived. Instead, the goal of Genesis is to follow the story of redemption. So sometimes Genesis will follow someone's family tree for a little bit, and then it'll just leave it because they aren't in the redemptive line. The other thing that's important to know is that the Bible isn't necessarily meant to be a science textbook. While there is science in it, everything in the Bible is scientifically accurate, but it's not meant to explain or address every single scientific issue. This is why the creation story isn't even necessarily meant to show us exactly how God did everything, but instead to show us that God did everything. And also, the Bible isn't necessarily meant to be a book of geography. But whatever the Bible shares geographically is accurate, and that's just been proven over and over and over again. So before we get into it, let me just answer one more question, and that is, who is the author of Genesis? The author of Genesis is Moses, and through Genesis through Deuteronomy, the entire Torah. Some will go to great lengths to challenge the authorship of Moses. Some have about 100 years ago, there was what was called the documentary hypothesis, that each book was a different writer, and it was, anyway, that has largely been disproven, and most people don't even hold to that anymore. But if you go to the Gospels, Jesus said that Moses wrote it. So for me, that settles it. But Moses lived in what was called the Late Bronze Era. That is about 1550 to about 1200 BC. And the Exodus, there's two different dates for the Exodus. I personally believe in what's called an early date for the Exodus, which is around 1445 BC. So Genesis is written somewhere after that time, and of course the other books of the law as well. So we go back to the beginning and understand kind of the dilemma that mankind finds themselves in. And so if the Bible is about redemption, and we've talked about that, why do we need redemption? That's where the book of Genesis comes in. So it begins with the creation account. And it's a worthy study, by the way. If you want to say, how does Genesis 1 square up with science? It is a worthy study. I just don't know that it was the book of Genesis is necessarily, the goal of it is to give us an explanation of the universe. Remember, who was Moses writing to? Which, by the way, is an extremely important hermeneutical principle, or a principle of Bible interpretation. That is, what was the author's intent to the audience to which he was writing to? Moses was writing to a group of people who had been slaves in Egypt for 400 years, surrounded by the pantheon of Egyptian gods. And this is where sometimes we can miss that and think, oh, Moses is writing a science textbook. No, he's not necessarily trying to make that point. He's trying to make the point that God created the heavens and the earth. Not gods, just Yahweh, not any of the other gods, not Amun-Ra, not Marduk, or some of the other gods at the time, but instead Yahweh was the one who created everything. In Genesis, we find something so amazing, and that is that mankind becomes the pinnacle of creation, not an afterthought of creation, which, once again, if you look at like the Babylonian myths of creation, mankind is completely an afterthought, made with the remains of a defeated God. And so, but mankind becomes the pinnacle of creation when God says in Genesis 1, verse 26, let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, that it may rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, over the livestock, all the animals, and over all of the creatures that move on the ground. So God created mankind in his own image, in the image of God. He created him, male and female. He created them. And this is what I think is just so amazing. So God creates mankind in his image. And then, of course, when we get later in Exodus, he'll say, hey, no idols, nothing that looks like anything in creation. And so instead of worshiping creation, you'll actually be the steward and ruling over creation. Listen, every single pagan culture at that time worshiped nature, worshiped the elements of nature, worshiped the animals of nature, or some mixture of all three. And so God is establishing through Moses an entirely different worldview. And that, I think, is what's really important. So Genesis is written by Moses. Now, the first question is, how does Moses get all this information from before he's born, right? So if he's not born until the first chapter of, first couple chapters of Exodus, then how does he get all this information about Genesis? Well, there's a couple of thoughts here. The first is that it could have been divine transmission. That is, God just literally tells Moses what to write. And that is consistent with how God has revealed himself in other parts of Scripture, right? God reveals the future to the prophets, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. So it's possible that he could have done that. The other thing is God, it could have been told to Moses what has happened in the past through others. And there's a likelihood of that there were records of God's dealing with humanity from the beginning. And this is why there's such a personal touch that I think we see, like Abraham's prayer for the city of Sodom, his offering of Isaac. And all of these things kind of give evidence that there were first-hand accounts. Now, that's personally where I lean, that there were other documents available and that these were all collected by Moses. The stories of the patriarchs, they were collected by Moses. Abraham comes from a country where reading and writing were very common. So once again, he could have brought all this with him because more than 3/4 of the book of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, really are dealing with one family, the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and of course, Jacob's children. And so the events of their lives, including written records, were certainly known to Joseph. And so his position in Egypt would have made it very easy for him to collect and preserve any records of his forefathers in written form. Another possibility depends on what's called the tightness of the genealogies, meaning that there are no gaps in the genealogies, because in Hebrew, there's no word for grandfather. There's just your father, and you see this in several places. In the Gospel of Matthew, for example, we get the genealogy of Jesus, and I wrote this down. Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. Now, Matthew's genealogy has gaps in it, and that is because it says that Josiah fathered Jeconiah. Now, Jeconiah was his grandfather. Jehoiakim was his father. And so Matthew is trying to keep the genealogies at 3 sets of 14 for the purposes of memorization. So if the genealogy, so I say this because some say it's possible that the genealogies aren't tight. If the genealogies are tight, like what we're given is totally accurate, that this is actually the father, maybe not the grandfather of, then Adam is a contemporary with Lamech, who is the father of Noah. And Noah's son Shem is around at the same time as Abraham. And so it's very likely that the story or the written records could have been passed on that way. The book of Genesis divides itself into 9 sections, and it does for one purpose, to get us to Abraham and his children in the line of redemption. So it begins with from chapters 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 3, tells us the story of redemption. Then it moves to chapter 2, verse 4, tells us Adam's story. It goes that way until chapter 5, verse 1, because it's moving away from Adam's story, telling Noah's story. In chapter 6, verse 9 says, these are the generations of Noah. And then in chapter 10, it says, these are the generations of the sons of Noah. Why? Because it's leading us to one particular son of Noah, Shem. In chapter 11, verse 10, it says, these are the generations of Shem. And because Shem has a descendant named Terah. Terah has a son named Abraham. And see how it's all kind of getting us to one family. In chapter Genesis 11:27, it says, these are the generations of Terah. So God is going to call Abraham and make him the father of the Jewish people. But Abraham has two sons. And it starts giving us both paths. This is in Genesis 25:12. These are the generations of Ishmael. But it's only going to go for a little bit. And then in chapter 25, verse 19, these are the generations of Isaac. And then it's going to go back to the big story that God is telling. Isaac has two sons. And so it'll follow Esau, the older son, for a little bit. And in chapter 36, it'll say, these are the generations of Esau. Then we go back to chapter 37. These are the generations of Jacob. And the goal of Genesis is to show us the focus of the Bible, to ultimately lead us to the person of redemption, to Jesus. So Genesis gives us the creation story, the fall of man, the need of mankind for a Savior and for redemption, and it moves us to the family that will bring about redemption. And so it gets to one family in chapter 12, and then it follows that family, and that's where Genesis ends. At the children of Israel in Egypt during the famine under the leadership of Joseph, which is the family of redemption. And so hope that kind of helps a little bit with the book of Genesis, and then we'll pick it up in the book of Exodus next time. So I hope this has been helpful to you. And once again, until the next video, I want to encourage you, keep reading. We'll see you then.